I'd like to call this meeting to order, and I'd like to ask Dr. Watts to introduce Mr. Ben Rarick.
Well, I will do that, and knowing that, thank you, President Venkatachalam, and members of the board, staff, and community members, thank you for being here for our work session to discuss and bring a little more clarity to our budget planning session through 2018-19 budget planning update. We'll call eventually Ben Rarick, who will come when he is ready to present. No, I understand. That's right. Ben, you are, and to amazing staff in budget and finance, to Lisa and Sarah as well. I know you'll be part of this presentation as well, and the hard work that has gone to. We definitely appreciate it, where we are versus where we've been. And speaking of Ben, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, so if I can take a personal point of privilege and just say that in between bargaining and the presentations and everything, these two fine professionals over here are burning, what do they say, both ends of the candle? Is that how it works? I mean, 5 minutes ago, thrashing around. So I really appreciate the work. It's been an exhilarating experience, and I hope the efforts are showing through. So this is presentation 3 of 3. So we've had 2 before, right? And I'm trying to make these make sense in a sequence. The first, we really did get into kind of educating you about kind of all that's going on with state law and the changes and what an enrichment levy is and what's going to happen to your local levy, and right. Second one, we really got into the revenues, and we looked at FTE, and you saw the changes in budgeted FTE for classified staff, for certificated staff. And so for the final step here, what we're trying to do, and this was a question that was asked by at least 3 board members, is kind of the different ways of seeing a budget. Want to see it by object. I want to see it by activity. I want to see it by program, right? So we made an extra effort, and when I say we, I mean them, to show you the budget through those different lenses, if you will. And they each tell a slightly different story, and they're each illuminating in their own way. And so we'll just get right into it here. Okay. So what we're going to show you are preliminary F195 numbers. So what we tried to do was aggregate salaries and benefits to the staff data that you saw last time. You'll see the depiction by activity, by object, and by program. Okay, so activity, an example of that would be how much do we spend on teaching as an activity. By object, an example of that would be how much do we spend on salaries. Okay. By program, an example of that might be how much do we spend on regular instruction versus compensatory education. Okay. We'll talk about fund balance, a little bit about outlook, and then at the conclusion of our first presentation, and then to some extent at the conclusion of the second, you all asked a series of questions, and we were kind of frantically taking notes, you remember. And so hopefully we'll leave enough time. We do have a list. We think some of these slides answer the questions that you were asking, but there may be some lingering ones, and we've prepared, in some cases, a sheet of paper, in some cases we'll just answer your question, make sure that you're fully satisfied with what you get. All right, any questions before we, good? Okay. Okay, so again, one of the things that we are trying to do is you can kind of get lost in the numbers a little bit, but continually try to connect the process we're going through to the strategic plan. And I think there are at least 2 ways that will come up throughout the presentation today where the budget specifically addresses a goal that the board has. Tonight I'll be touching on goal 1 and goal 2, but in some ways they touch all the goals, but just as an effort to cultivate the strategic plan as a conversation, you'll see me reference these later on in the presentation. All right. So here is the general fund revenue information, but depicted in a slightly different way, in a slightly more detailed way, because I think it was, somebody asked for it in a more detailed manner. A lot of data on this page, and so you'll see my style is sometimes I'll give you a lot of data, but then I'll call out a couple of numbers to ask you to focus on those because they're meaningful in some way. All right, so let's look first of all at the first call out, which is kind of the, what do you call those, call out box there in the top right hand corner. You see a $6.7 million number. Okay, so what that is, it represents the change in projected fund balance from last year to this year. And so people are understandably focused on where we will land this year, but I don't want the fact to be lost that regardless of where we land, this has been a huge swing in the sense that the district was starting $5.6 million in the hole and is in, you know, I think in good shape to end positive, okay? People tend to conflate the two things. They think if you don't end positive, you didn't make a huge amount of progress. You're digging out of a significant hole. And so a $6.7 million swing is very sizable, okay? The second thing is we have talked at various points about this kind of two-step down in the amounts that you'll be allowed to raise in your local levy and also the changes in the way that you'll be allowed to use that local levy. And so that's the one red number you see on that chart, or excuse me, on that column there that represents change from 17-18 budget. You see fairly significant increases in state and sometimes federal funding, $18.9 million projected loss in local levy revenue just in the first year, okay? Okay. With each one of these slides, you'll see an accompanying pie chart. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the pie charts, but sometimes people like to see it that way, so it's for your reference. Okay. Here is a depiction of general fund expenditures by, this time, major program. Remember the different ways of seeing? Okay. You'll see object, you'll see program, you'll see activity, you'll see in some cases fund. Okay. Talking about connecting the strategic plan, and one of the things that's exciting about what the state has done in this budget round, not just for the Kent School District, for many districts, is that the pots of money that are directed to addressing opportunity gaps for students are increasing. I want you to see here in this chart the column that says change from 17-18 budget, okay? You'll see special education funding increasing considerably. Compensatory education is the phrase that we use to refer to lap bilingual, okay? And here is, I think, an adjustment that's going to be needed in this preliminary F195 is that we are, on the one hand, experiencing considerable funding increases in these programs. And the other hand, we see here that our preliminary 18-19 budget is still down in those areas, okay? So people have not fully come to grips with the fact that this is a significant shift for these compensatory programs and will benefit those students that we talk about in Goal 1, okay? So that's a little check mark to put down is to kind of additional work on the future of LAP and bilingual programs for the Kent Public School District. Okay. I'd like you to make a little note on this slide if you would. So this is expenditures by object. This is showing, you know, we figured going back further than 16-17 is probably a bit much, but it shows you actuals and budgeted for the last few years. Okay. The one thing I'd like you to note is the $11.7 million number on the payroll tax and other benefits. As we were preparing this presentation, we realized, you see that second to last column there? Okay, that's too large. We think that that number is an error and that in fact, some of that money is actually, should be in the certificated salary and classified salary line. So I want you to make a mark on your copy. We'll be providing you probably another copy tomorrow or the day after that reconciles those lines, but the full amount is a fair representation, okay? A couple things to note on this slide. Not sizable increases in certificated salary and classified salaries projected, in part because, as you saw the last time we met, not huge increases projected for staffing, right? Remember, you actually saw a reduction in projected certificated staffing and a slight modest increase in classified staffing, so it shouldn't surprise that the total aggregate amount for salaries is not a large increase. Okay, different ways of seeing. We've been through object, we've been through program. Now we're going to take a look at expenditures by activity. Okay, again, a lot of data on the slide, but I'm going to ask you to focus in on a few numbers here. You'll see in the far left-hand corner the various activity groups for the general fund: teaching activities, teaching support, building administration, building operations, central administration, transportation, food services, and other support services. Couple of interesting things happening in the data. First of all, when you look at that, I think it's purple, violet color there, middle column, teaching activities is budgeted at the highest percentage that you've seen in any of the previous 3 years, okay? Which I would think would be a good sign, okay? And aligns to goal 1, okay? Another thing to look at, central administration budgeted is down. Okay, you see that? It's at 5.09%. Previous years were in the high fives. So you see not a huge shift, but you see a shift of additional, as a percentage of the budget, more being directed to teaching activities and slightly less being directed to central administration, which shouldn't be a great surprise given the considerable personnel realignment that the district has undertaken in the past year. Okay. So I have 2 slides for you here on staffing. One is summary, one is more detailed. This shows, again with the violet color I'll call it, preliminary budget 18-19 by the 3 major staffing groups. And then the change from 17-18 represented there in that next column. Okay. I think a good takeaway here is you'll see that as it relates to budget, because you've seen before as it compared to actuals, but as you relate budget to budget, each of the 3 groups is down, but administrators as a percentage is down the most, which kind of comports with the slide you saw before, right? This slide here, right? That you see a corresponding slight increase in the amount of resources directed to teaching activities and a, you know, again, not a huge change, but a relatively, a small but meaningful change in the amount directed away from administration, which I believe was a question asked at the last. Okay. Several of the questions that you asked pertained to kind of the future of local levies and the enrichment budget. So you here have 2 slides. One is a overview slide and the other more detailed. And even though the size of the respective pots is changing, it remains true that the local levy will continue to be an essential part of our budgeting strategy because many of the positions that Kent School District relies on for what we consider to be basic services are not funded under the state's prototypical school model. And this illustrates that at a high level, okay? So you see 18-19 budgeted positions, the number of FTE funded under the state formula, and the difference. Classified staff has always been, not just in Kent, but pretty much across the state, the single largest unfunded group. So that is not unusual for Kent to be in that position. And so the last time that we talked about this, we talked about this in the context of the enrichment budget and questions about what that is. So the state has defined the one of the allowable, kind of one of the guideposts for what an enrichment budget can be is anything that the state has not funded that you employ beyond the prototypical model, you can include as part of your enrichment budget. So you're seeing examples of that here.
Sorry, Ben, you can include staff, that's what you're saying?
Yes. Yes, you can. Okay. The other thing that obviously pops off the page here is the negative 61 at the top. Okay. Does anybody have a sense as to why that number is negative? It's negative because of the decision that the district has made this year and in previous years to not staff up to that K to 317 to 1 provision, which is not required by law now, which is why that is allowed, but is still part of the law and will eventually be a requirement of the district. So a vast majority of what you see there in terms of that 61.1 number would eventually have to be closed to comply with that provision of the law, providing it doesn't change. Okay. This goes to the next layer of detail. You all asked a lot of questions about the enrichment levy last time we talked, so it seemed worthwhile to give you more detail. So in the same way that here you saw the 3 groups, this is breaking down for you position titles within those groups, okay? And indeed, classroom teachers are the largest single component of that number on the previous page, okay, that's 61, right, per our conversation about K-3 class size. School nurses is my favorite anecdote about the mismatch between the profound needs in the district and what the state doesn't fund in its prototypical model. So right now, we're funding, we have in our budget 22.3 school nurses, over 63 ESAs, so guidance counselors, social workers, psychologists, and you can see the net difference there in the first column of what the state's allocating for those. 4 nurses. So if we didn't have a levy, we would get 4 school nurse FTEs funded at a lower rate than what we pay. would be that reality. Okay. Okay. So we have attempted to take the FTE that you've seen in the previous presentation, attach salary and benefits to that information, and make a projection about the fund balance for the next year. Okay? Couple caveats. First of all, we have not built in the capacity that the district always does, both on the expenditure and revenue side. And we need to fully investigate this anomaly on the payroll benefits piece. But we think this is a materially correct number that will just change incrementally and felt like it was worthy to bring to the board. Okay? Now, before we go over this, let's revisit kind of the conversations that we have had about the next 4 years and about how next year is our best year. It's actually any district's best year because the state funding comes immediately while the local funding takes time to go down, right? So that first year is the best year. And so what I've started to talk about is maybe a phrase that might resonate with stakeholders and members of the board is a rainy day fund. You know, that when you know that there's years in the future that are not going to look as positive as the year that you're in, the premise of saving some money for a rainy day fund so that you can remain compliant with a board policy of 5% fund balance, you know, is arguably a good practice, a best practice, okay? And so that's part of what you see reflected here, okay? There's a lot of data here, but given where we've been, I just want to be totally and completely transparent with you. You can ask all the questions you want about every level of this data, but this is the detailed line of every revenue source that we get. Change 17-18 to preliminary budget 18-19 as a delta from projected actual 17-18. And also on the expenditure side, our projections, okay? Right now, that puts us at a projected fund balance of $37 million at the end of next year, okay? Now, you're thinking, wow, that's very big. Remember where you're headed, right? Remember where you're headed in terms of the ability to not just be at 5%, but to sustain 5% over a period of time where the rate at which you might expect to grow on a year-to-year basis is not supported by the growth in your revenues over the same period of time. So that completes my review of the data-heavy slides. I have included some reference overview slides, because you remember last time we went over each of the other 4 funds. I've included a summary slide for those 4 funds for your reference. This one is, hold on just a second here. Okay, this one is just the year-to-year change for those 4 funds, and this represents the ending fund balance for those funds next year. Okay. And then at this time, we'd like to take the opportunity to answer all the questions that you asked. And I'm going to ask Lisa to join me and Sarah to join me, and we'll probably just kind of take turns answering those questions that we have. And then at the conclusion of that, if you had other questions that we didn't get to, we can use that time for dialogue. Okay? Any questions of me before we get to that part?
Not yet.
Okay.
I have some questions on the other stuff, but
All right, very
might
good.
be answered.
Very good. All right, so maybe we can start with the activity object stuff and see if all our questions were answered on that.
Okay, I'll start off with summarizing some of the questions you've had previously, I think actually over the course of the past 2 meetings. One of the questions that I think came forward was looking for at least current, but maybe also some historical variance information, budget to actual. So I actually have done that analysis, and I've presented it. And this sheet here would show actual variances as of the month of May, and I've shown it by the major categories. So I've shown variances by program, activity, and object, so you can kind of see it in 3 different ways. And I can have that available for your review. Some of the other questions were that you had asked to see the budget presented in more detail for each school, which those pages were, if you remember, the ASBO budget that I prepared. Those were in there, but I also plan on including those in your budget document sometime in August. Need to get going on that. So each school will have a detailed page so you can really see enrollment information, specific funding sources, and expenditure levels for each school, so you can really get a good feel for it at that level. Program-based budget reports, again, I think we started to show that, but in your budget document, it will be, you'll see that in much more detail, specifically by program, and I believe I plan to actually expand the different programs where that would be informative, such as inclusive education, really give you a more in-depth view of the program as it's budgeted for 18-19. So that will be coming. Let's see here. You had asked for if we could prepare or compile a complete picture of the types of support that each school receives, because all of our schools receive many different grants. You know, some of them are very small, but we have, Kathy Hyatt actually has done a great job of compiling a list by school of all of those other community support pieces that, by school, so that will also be forthcoming. Let's see. I have also prepared a detail. I think there's been some concern about the whole contract services object code. So I've done some detail analysis on being able to show you exactly what those vendors are and what services they're actually providing. So again, forthcoming document that you can really drill down and see the detail, not only the volume of those payments going out, but you'll be able to see all of the vendors and the purposes of those payments. I think that is all off of my list. Sarah, do you have anything that you might want to add? Is there anything I missed that you thought you had maybe asked for that is either not in the works or I've missed?
Just clarification. The program-based budgeting, we are going to see the revenue and expenditure together, right? Not
Right,
like
right.
we saw the slide earlier.
Right, so what you'll see in your budget document is, for example, LAP. You'll see, here's our funding sources, here's our expenditures, so you kind of see the whole picture of the program, kind of on one page, so it's real clear. So you don't have to, pay, beginning of the book, back of the book, you'll be able to see it on one page.
Okay, and will it include the CAS and the CLS?
It will provide, it will show staffing, right, it'll show staffing that are charged to that particular program, funding sources, staffing, expenditures, probably by object, it would be most appropriate for something like that.
Perfect.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
So I think one thing that I had asked before, Nate, is the view out past 2000 next year. So kind of what does that, because I know when you put up your one slide and you're like, okay, this is where we think we're going to be at the end of next year with
Yes.
fund balance.
Yes.
And then, everybody's going to go, oh, wait, you've got all kinds of money at the end of next year. And I know we've talked a couple of times now about the reducing of funding that's going to be coming
Yes.
our way. And so when will we actually see a little bit more?
Within days.
Okay.
And I think we've shared this before, that is actually a required part of the F-195 this year, so there will be I haven't really seen it yet, I don't know if it's one, I think it's just going to be one page where you'll see that required part of the F-195.
Yes, all right.
Were there any other
Old
questions?
questions, new questions? I have new questions. So actually, about that, going back, I think you showed a fund balance projected for next year, 37.5 million, something like that. And so, because a lot of that's money that we're going to get, but we need to spend over the next 4 years. And so I think what I'm trying to drill into now is like, okay, how do we balance budget restoration versus we need to save more in our rainy day fund for 2021 or 2022, whatever that is. And so going back, one of the things I'd asked for was, it is more of a variance analysis from where we think we're going to end this year to project a budget next year, which is, all right, what are the changes that we've already taken place? So here's our organizational changes, here's our attrition changes, and then here's the standard change of, here's what it looks like because we're budgeting at full FTEs, or just general budget changes that would happen year over year if we didn't do anything, compared to actuals. And then what are the extra things that we're getting, meaning extra revenue and it's applied, and we only get this extra revenue if we use it, so we have to spend this here, whatever that is. So
Yeah.
looking at, I mean, those are just three categories, but basically being able to identify the year-over-year change and figuring out what is just the annualized effect of changes we've already decided on.
Yes.
What is the general thing that happens year to year in budgeting, inflation, you budget
Yes.
for full staff, things like that?
Yes.
And then what are extra things that we've decided to do?
Yes. Okay. So I can answer that partly. So what became, I'm just going to put it out there so we can work on this together. So this slide
Yep.
and that number, negative $2 million for compensatory education. When I saw that, it doesn't resonate with me. That shouldn't be that way because of the nature of those pots of funds. So to do a 4-year outlook on that number, I got this number yesterday. So, I need to process that and figure out like, why is that coming as a negative when those programs collectively are experiencing a large increase, okay? That's not my first instinct as to what that number should be. So getting that number rectified kind of allows a more accurate 4-year depiction. But if you replicate that 4 times, it just would be, I think, misleading. Okay? So, and that's a pretty big deal in terms of what we show going out. The other part of your question with regards to kind of the new versus what's just an extension of what we've already changed, okay? So I can answer some of that. So basically carrying forward from last year to this year, what I'm carrying is the savings associated with the reorganization that the district undertook, both in central administration and in schools, okay? That carries forward. And a conservative estimate of the salary and kind of payroll-related expenses associated with the staff load that we have on the books right now, right? In terms of new expenditures, that's why this slide is so significant. The categorical programs, the LAP, the bilingual, the career and technical education, those in the outlook have been treated as those programs are going to grow. They should grow because otherwise that money will be returned, right? I'm not seeing that in this first batch of data I got back, so I need to make sure that that's an intentional decision. So, sometimes we have budget presentations that come on the heels of things that, so I anticipate being able to have that conversation in the next couple days, but that's got to be by design, and it's not what I was envisioning. I was envisioning that those programs would grow over the 4-year period.
And if I can just add one thing, I think part of why we're seeing the -4 is, again, because we have not yet built in our contingency, and that is a category where the majority of our contingency amounts usually are placed. So the combination of that, plus I think we probably expected a little bit more growth in those programs. So, as we finalize the budget, I think that will almost correct itself, partly.
Yeah, knock on wood.
I think because I get into it, and this is more of the go forward of taking that second to last column, and even the last column too, but mainly the second to last column, that number, and breaking that out by different causes, and saying when the numbers get more final. So I look at that top number, 11 million up in regular instruction. So how much of that is change in organization? How much of that is things, we hire more people, we have more people on board than we did in budget, or whatever that is. As we get there and kind of understanding how much is natural part of budgeting and how much is contingency, how much is an estimate that may not materialize, something like that.
Yep. We'd be happy to do that. And are doing that.
Yes.
That's really what we're doing right now.
So tonight, we have that capital facilities plan.
Yes.
That's on the.
Yes.
And how closely are you working with that plan, and how do the changes that happen here, do we update that plan, or how does that work?
So, the plan kind of landed on my desk just by default. So I've handled the plan this year. I'm probably not the right person going forward, but I am the person to be able to answer those questions. There is interplay. One of the things that plan relies on is, your plan's about class size and your capacity to provide certain class sizes in the plan. It's called the standard of service. So in theory, as you change your assumptions about what class size you're going to be offering, you make changes in your capital facilities plan to show that you're building that capacity over a period of time. That's one change. Enrollment is also another significant part of that. So independent of what you're doing with class size, they want to know, do you expect to grow a lot? Are you going to grow modestly? In our case, we expect to grow modestly. And that influences whether you show capacity or need. I mean, this year's capital facility plan, because there was no new major projects suggested, it really was an update, essentially, for inflation and enrollment. And, you know, it just depends on, you do it each year. Some years you're going to build an entire new school and you've got to re-rack all of your assumptions. And, you know, this year I basically updated the plan for all the required data that King County requires, updated the impact fee proposal by inflation. But, you know, every few years, especially when you pass a new bond or, you know, there's some significant change in your plans for providing capital facilities, you got to tear into that plan a bit.
Yeah, I just noticed the K through 3 enrollment, not enrollment, class size information. Even though we're not following that this year,
Right.
that's still,
It's looming out there somewhere, yeah.
so you're going
Yes.
to, you're going to consider that as
Yes.
part of the plan
Yes.
this year.
Yes.
Moving forward. So
Yes.
when you need to make those changes, it doesn't happen till the next year?
That's correct. It's a year we have to update this plan annually.
Yeah.
And we send it to city councils who in turn charge impact fees. And I've learned all this in the last 3 months. Now I'm an expert. But you're right to say that there is interplay between the general fund budget and that plan, because it really is kind of a message about what your standard of service is.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
Question I now realize I have looking at the data from last time. So there was a slide you showed on the MSOC budget report. It looks like it was some kind of state report. It was very strange.
Yep.
It showed here's how much MSOC revenue you get from the state formula, and then here's what we're choosing to spend by program.
Yes.
Which is more. So it's like $5.2 million more. And so the general question I have is, what could we reduce, meaning knowing things that we can't not do, not spend, what would we have to give up if we went back down to that state number? It was a general question. You may not have the answer now, I know that, but it was, you know, if they only give us 33.3 and we have 38.5, what are we deciding to spend more on?
Well,
Go ahead.
so the MSOC allocation is allocated strictly for basic ed, which includes really basic ed and CTE. So we're only looking at those programs, not any of the categorical programs. So to reduce our expenditures down to the level that we're actually funded for, you know, I guess that would just mean, you know, whatever that percentage would be, and reduce expenditures in those areas, in those programs by that percentage. So I mean, it could be as simple as that, or it could be a little bit more difficult situation, such as, you know, elimination of programs. But if we could do a, you know, just straight percentage reduction, or looking further. But to be over our allocation is not unusual or abnormal. I mean, there wouldn't be any district that would be, you know, at the level that we're funded for, or certainly not below. So the fact that we're over what we're allocated for, it's kind of like the staffing over formula. We'll never, well, I shouldn't say never, but it would be rare that we would operate at a staffing level that matched our allocation. I mean, in a perfect world, an ideal world, but.
One thing about total spend, and let me know if I'm thinking about this correctly, is like, okay, if we decide it's $5.2 million, it means that money has to come from somewhere else. We either take it from the local levies, considered enrichment, we take it from something else, I don't know what that is, you know, based on allowable general fund, and so at some point there is a pull from some other area that we're deciding to do this. And then I just kind of want to understand, if that's true, then what are we deciding to pull away from something else and put here? That's a general question regarding to any time that we're putting money in. Is it saying, yes, we are definitely saying all of this is local levies, and therefore, when we say, here's X million dollars of local levies, we spend 5.2 on this. Or is it coming from some other general fund? Is it coming from a federal thing? Yeah, you know, whatever it is, just understanding where that comes from a revenue source.
I'm going to, just to clarify, Director Hardy, if I'm hearing you correctly, and what we are hearing is how are we prioritizing, given limited allocations from state or whatever revenue streams are, how are we allocating or prioritizing our spending? I think we can certainly speak to our blueprint, our strategic plan. Our first goal among equals is student success, so our priority would ideally, just as we've touched on, we want to make sure that we're doing the least amount of harm to our local schools and our classrooms, and priorities would then be discussed based on need. Right now, we have a great need based on our current budget challenges, which leads me to a follow-up question about our current budget conditions. I will ask in a second, but we will be prioritizing. I think that's, well, we may not have the answers today. I know that a prioritization method and strategy would be put in place so that it would make those decisions easier, certainly not easy.
Right, because I want to make sure like we either consciously made this decision or that's just how the budget rolled up and we're just going with it. And there's a spectrum in between there, but just understanding what that is for future information you provide.
Anyone else? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Rivera.
Here's my last question.
Oh, sorry. Dr. Watson's question.
Just one follow-up, which I heard early on, and just for our own edification, I think while we're not here to celebrate, we are here to acknowledge the work that we started off with a conversation of the hard and smart work that we've put in, the sacrifices that have been made, and we don't take that lightly. And while the projected end-of-year fund balance is, relatively speaking, it is low, it does reflect a significant accomplishment. So I'd like to ask this: if all things being equal, expenditures as they are remaining equal, if we maintain status quo in terms of our previous levels of spending, what would we project the end-of-year fund balance to be, or what would be the estimate, again, if we continued our spending patterns?
Talking about this fiscal year 18.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, I think I'm doing the budget status presentation
Yes.
in the regular meeting, but that is for May, and so the May projection is 1.1 million. In reality, I suspect that will, because I've already started looking at June, I'm already a month, beyond what I'll be presenting tonight. So I suspect, probably a more realistic number would be 800, around 700,000 to 800,000. There's still some unknowns. July payroll, as we know, is high, and we're anticipating that that's going to be higher than probably previous years, just because of the year that we're in. So we're anticipating that. I feel like my numbers have that, incorporated, but until we really see what July's final payroll looks like, if I had that number, I could give you a better estimate on our ending fund balance. But
I think you're answering a different question, which I appreciate as well. The question I'm asking is, if we did, well, I said nothing, but if our spending patterns remain the same, while we made some significant cost-saving adjustments to get to where we are, if we were spending in the same way,
Next year?
yes.
Oh, that is a different question.
oh yeah,
That's why I
yeah.
asked if you meant
Okay.
next year.
Yes.
okay.
Okay. So you mean fiscal year 19? Okay.
Well,
Well, that's a different animal.
let me. Here's my response.
Estimate, if you would.
I suspect our fund balance would be much larger, because we would be spending. We would still have this significant spending controls in place. We're not so much operating in that mode next year. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how wide of an appreciation there is for this, but the spending controls this year were austere. Like, it was very difficult to spend money in this district because of the situation. And the question is just how sustainable is that? You know, I mean, it really, like, there's, I mean, you know, we've gone over this, but it really, every purchase order, you know, every, and so just as a mode of operation for a district of this size going forward, it's like, what, you know, what does it mean to kind of achieve a normalcy that's still fiscally responsible, you know? You want to just bounce back to this situation that got you here in the first place, but, you know, what's like normalcy? You know, and we think about that in the context of professional development and, you know, not all travel is bad, you know, people need to, you know, these sorts of things. So we're not doing any travel this year. We're not doing any, you know. And so, yeah, if we kept doing what we were doing, it would be a lot less. It's just a question of like, what does that represent for a vision 2, 3, 4 years down the road? You know, that's the.
Yeah, I would think that we would need to look at the next year, the following year as well, because we're not going to be in that cushy spot the following 2 years, so. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Warwick.
Thank you.
Ms. Tyler. Ms. Demla, thank you. All right, so if there are no other questions, we are going to recess and get back here. Well, we're going to recess for a 6:30 executive session, and we will resume at 7 p.m. for our regular meeting. All right, thank you.